Pick up a warm cup of tea. Hold it with both hands. The warmth spreads through the palms, into the tissue between the metacarpal bones, through the skin of the fingers. Ruffini endings. Thermal receptors tuned to warm temperatures. Fire and send signals through C-fiber afferents to the posterior insular cortex. That is where you become consciously aware that your hands are warm. The sensation is familiar. You have felt it 10,000 times. What you have not felt, what no one feels consciously, is what the warmth is doing to your social judgment. The temperature of that cup is changing what you think about other people, not your mood, not your comfort level. Your assessment of whether the next person you speak to is trustworthy or suspicious, generous or selfish, warm or cold. The physics of why traces to a structure in your brain where temperature sensation and social evaluation share overlapping neurons. And it was demonstrated in an experiment so simple it reads like a thought experiment rather than a published study. In 2008, 2 psychologists at Yale asked strangers in an elevator to hold a cup of coffee for a few seconds while the researcher fumbled with paperwork. Half the strangers held a warm cup, half held an ice cup. Minutes later, in a completely separate task with no apparent connection, each stranger read a description of a fictional person and rated their personality. The strangers who had held the warm cup rated the person as significantly warmer, more generous, and more caring. The strangers who had held the ice cup rated the identical person as colder, more selfish, and less trustworthy. The cup they had held for 10 seconds, a cup belonging to someone they would never see again, changed their judgment of a person who did not exist. Thermal signal does not stop at the posterior insula. It propagates forward, into a transition zone where the insular cortex does something that neuroscience did not expect. It processes the warmth from your cup through neurons that also participate in social evaluation. The anterior insular cortex, where trust, empathy, fairness, and the felt sense of another person's character are generated, shares neural substrate with the posterior region that just registered the temperature of your tea, not adjacent substrate. Overlapping substrate. Neurons in the transition zone participate in both thermal processing and social-emotional processing. The warmth from your cup travels through some of the circuitry that will activate when you assess whether the next person you speak to is trustworthy or suspicious, generous or selfish, warm or cold. Contamination is invisible to you. You will never feel it happening. Your insular cortex does not report to your consciousness which inputs are influencing its outputs. It integrates thermal and social data through shared circuits, produces a judgment, and delivers that judgment to your conscious mind as though it were the product of pure social reasoning. You believe you are evaluating a person objectively. You are evaluating a person through neural circuitry whose activation state was shifted by the cup you held 5 minutes ago, and the insular cortex will never disclose that to you. Insular cortex is, right now, in your brain, if you are holding something warm, running social cognition on thermal hardware. The cup is not a metaphor for comfort. It is an input to the neural system that generates your judgment of other people. And the reason the overlap exists is not a design flaw. It is a design feature with an evolutionary origin that is 65 million years deep, and it explains why warmth has felt like safety for your entire life. Think about the earliest experience your body ever had. Before you could see clearly, before you could walk, before you could form a memory you would later recall. You were held. The warmth of the body holding you was the first signal your developing nervous system received about whether the world was safe. For a primate infant, for every primate infant across the entire history of the primate lineage, thermal warmth and social warmth were physically identical. Your mother's body was the source of both. You could not thermoregulate independently. Your survival depended on contact with a warm body. Warm temperature meant a body was present. A body present meant safety. Harry Harlow demonstrated the primacy of this association in 1958. Infant rhesus monkeys separated from their mothers were given 2 surrogate options, a wire surrogate that dispensed milk and a cloth-covered surrogate that provided warmth and soft contact but no food. The infants overwhelmingly preferred the warm cloth surrogate, clinging to it for up to 18 hours a day. When they needed to feed, they would stretch from the cloth body to reach the wire surrogate's nipple without releasing their grip on the warmth. They refused to let go of the warm surrogate even to eat. Contact comfort, Harlow's term, was more important to the developing primate brain than nutrition. The infant survival calculus was not food first. It was warmth first. Your insular cortex wired itself around the input that your survival required most continuously, and that input was the thermal contact of another body against your skin. Association between thermal warmth and attachment security was constructed during the critical period of your neural development, the first weeks and months of life when the insular cortex was forming its functional architecture. The warm body equals safety mapping was not learned the way you learn a fact or a name. It was built into the circuitry the way a foundation is built into a building, structurally, during construction, before the building was occupied. The mapping does not dissolve with maturity. It does not weaken with education. It does not yield to conscious override. It persists because it was wired before you could form a declarative memory. The circuitry is still listening at 65, the way it was listening at 6 weeks. That evolutionary origin, millions of years of primate development in which warmth and safety were physically inseparable, wired into your insular cortex during the most plastic period of brain development, is the finding that made the warm cup research land differently for me. Because it means the cup is not exploiting a quirk. It is activating the deepest, oldest, most foundational association your social brain contains. Now, what the Williams and Barg study actually measured. Because the experiment was not just about judgment, it was about behavior, and the behavioral finding is what moves the result from curiosity to consequence. Lawrence Williams, then a graduate student, and John Barg designed the study in 2 parts. First was the elevator, 41 participants, and the effect size was large enough that no participant in the warm condition rated the target below the midpoint on warmth traits. Second experiment, 53 participants held either a warm or cold therapeutic pad and then chose between a reward for themselves or a gift for a friend. Those who held the warm pad were significantly more likely to choose the gift. Published in Science, 2008. Object changed not just what people thought, but what people did. The thermal signal propagated from the skin, through the insular cortex, into the decision-making circuitry that determines whether a person acts generously or selfishly. Participants who had briefly held warmth gave more than participants who had held cold. The body altered the behavior without the person knowing the body was involved. No participant reported the cup as a factor in their decision. No participant connected the thermal pad they had held minutes earlier to the choice between keeping a reward and giving a gift. The thermal priming operated entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness, and the behavioral change it produced was attributed by the participants to their own personality, their own values, their own sense of what felt right. They believe they chose the gift because they are generous people. The data suggests they chose the gift partly because the pad in their hands was warm. You see, this is where the finding enters your daily life. Because you have been holding warm and cold objects before conversations, before meetings, before judgments, for your entire life. The cup of tea before the phone call with your daughter. The cold glass of water in the waiting room before the doctor. The warm coffee held during a conversation with a neighbor. Each of those thermal inputs was being processed by your insular cortex through the transition zone that processes your social evaluation of the person you were about to speak to or were speaking to. Warmth or coldness of the object in your hands was tilting your social judgment, not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but measurably, in the direction the thermal signal predicted. And you attributed the judgment entirely to the other person. The neighbor seemed warm because they were kind. The doctor seemed distant because they were rushed. But part of the warmth came from the coffee in your hands. Part of the distance came from the cold water in the waiting room. Your insular cortex mixed the thermal input into the social output, and your conscious mind received the blended result as a single judgment about a single person, never suspecting the cup had a vote. Every first impression you have ever formed was formed by a brain simultaneously processing the ambient temperature and the thermal state of your hands. Through shared neural circuits, below conscious awareness, with no disclosure to you, that the physical environment was influencing the social evaluation. And then, the reverse pathway. Because if physical warmth shifts social judgment, you would expect social experience to shift physical perception. And it does, in a way you may recognize from your own life. Remember a time you were excluded, left out of a gathering, ignored in a conversation, overlooked for something you expected to be part of. Remember the physical sensation that accompanied the social experience. Many people describe it as cold, a chill, a withdrawal of warmth, a sense of the room getting colder. That description is not metaphorical. Chen Bo-zhong and Jeffrey Leonardelli at the University of Toronto demonstrated in 2008 that participants who recalled an experience of social exclusion subsequently estimated the room temperature as measurably lower than participants who recalled inclusion. Both groups sat in one room at one actual temperature for one duration. Only variable was the social memory. The insular cortex received the social exclusion signal and produced a thermal output. The person genuinely felt colder because of a social experience, not because of a change in the room. Chill you felt after being extruded was not a metaphor your mind produced. It was a thermal signal your insular cortex generated, the structure that processes the warmth of a cup, processing the coldness of rejection through overlapping circuitry and delivering the result to your body as a genuine change in perceived temperature. Your skin did not cool. Your perception of the room's temperature shifted. The social coldness became physical coldness through the insular architecture that cannot separate the two. Reverse pathway means every social rejection you have experienced produced a thermal consequence in your body. Every argument that left you feeling cold was cold, not figuratively, but neurologically. Your insular cortex was translating the social signal into a thermal perception through the shared circuits that cannot distinguish the two inputs. The reverse also means every warm social encounter produced a thermal consequence. The conversation with the old friend that left you feeling warm, you were warm. The visit from the grandchild that made the house feel warmer, the house felt warmer. Your insular cortex was processing the social warmth through circuits that overlap with thermal processing, and the thermal output registered as a genuine change in your perception of ambient temperature. The social warmth became physical warmth through the architecture that cannot separate the two. The bidirectionality runs continuously in both directions, social to thermal and thermal to social, through every interaction, every day, without pause. When you feel socially excluded, the thermal circuits respond. You feel physically colder. When you hold something warm, the social circuits respond. You feel marginally safer, marginally more trusting, marginally more trusting, marginally more open. The bidirectionality is not a laboratory finding that requires special conditions to observe. It is operating in your body continuously in both directions, every day. The warm cup in your hands shifts your social evaluation. The cold reception from a colleague shifts your thermal perception. Both directions run through shared insular architecture, below your awareness, without your consent. Implication is unsettling once you see it. Every social judgment you have ever made was made in a thermal environment. Every thermal environment was being processed by your insular cortex alongside the social evaluation. The two inputs were being integrated through shared circuits, and the blended output was delivered to your consciousness as a judgment you believed was purely social. The temperature was never disclosed as a factor. You were never given the option to correct for it. The insular cortex does not offer that option. The integration happens before consciousness receives the result. Well, the loneliness research extends this into a pattern you may recognize. Because if social warmth and thermal warmth are processed through shared neural substrate, then the absence of social warmth should produce a behavioral drive toward physical warmth. And it does. Barg and Shalev at Yale published in 2012 that chronically lonely individuals take more frequent hot baths and showers, hold warm beverages for longer, and report greater comfort from heated blankets than non-lonely controls. Physical warmth partially satisfies the neural circuitry that social contact would normally satisfy. The substitution is not complete. A hot bath does not cure loneliness, but the temporary relief is neurologically real. The insular cortex receives the thermal signal and partially activates the social warmth circuits. The subjective experience is a brief reduction in the felt absence of social contact. A person over 65 who lives alone and takes a long hot bath every evening is not being indulgent. They are running a partial neural substitution, delivering thermal input to social circuits that evolved to receive warmth from another body. The bath is doing a fraction of what a hug would do through an identical insular pathway at a lower amplitude. The comfort is real. It is the insular cortex responding to a thermal signal the way it was built to respond, with a partial activation of the safety and attachment circuits that warmth has always triggered. If you have ever wondered why a hot bath after a lonely day feels emotionally different from a hot bath after a social day, why the warmth seems to matter more when you have been alone, the insular overlap explains it. On the social day, the attachment circuits receive their input from human contact. The thermal warmth of the bath is pleasant but redundant. The circuits are already satisfied. On the lonely day, the attachment circuits have been understimulated. The thermal warmth of the bath is the only input those circuits have received. Identical bath, identical temperature, identical duration. But the subjective experience is different because the insular cortex is processing the thermal input against a different baseline of social saturation. Cup held with both hands, tea cupped in the palms, coffee wrapped in the fingers, hot chocolate nursed through a long afternoon. Is that substitution at a smaller scale? The person feels marginally less alone while holding the warm cup than they did before picking it up. The effect is modest and temporary. It is also real, and it operates through the neural architecture that the Williams and Bargh study identified. Warm cup that the person living alone holds with both hands at breakfast is not a habit or an indulgence. It is a body seeking thermal input that partially activates social warmth circuits the way a body seeking water is responding to dehydration. The drive is not conscious. The relief is real. And if you have ever noticed that you hold your cup longer on days when you have spoken to fewer people, that the warmth matters more when the day has been quiet, you are observing the insular cortex adjusting its response to thermal input based on the baseline of social saturation it is processing alongside it. Honesty requires a pause here, because science demands transparency about replication, and the warm cup story is not as clean as the original study suggested. Leinart and colleagues in 2014 attempted to replicate the Williams and Bargh warm cup study with a larger sample across 3 sites. They did not find the effect on personality judgment. Failure matters and should not be minimized. Original sample was small. Effect size may have been inflated. The specific cup-to-judgment pathway at the magnitude Williams and Bargh reported has not been reliably reproduced. And here is the critical distinction. The broader phenomenon of temperature-cognition interaction has been replicated across multiple paradigms by independent laboratories. I.J. Zerman and Semin found that warm room temperatures increase perceived social proximity. Kang and colleagues found that warm therapeutic pads increase trust in economic game experiments. Zhong and Leonardelli's reverse pathway has been replicated. Bargh and Shalev's loneliness, warmth substitution data has been confirmed in subsequent studies. Honest summary. The warm cup probably does something to your social judgment. How much it does from a 10-second hold is less certain than the original study claimed. That your body's thermal state influences your social cognition is not in serious dispute. The convergent evidence from multiple paradigms, laboratories, and methods establishes the phenomenon. The mechanism, insular cortex overlap, is anatomically established. The evolutionary logic is sound. The specific dose-response relationship, how warm, for how long, producing how much shift in judgment, is still being calibrated. What is not debated is that the relationship exists, that it operates below your conscious awareness, and that it runs through neural architecture you share with every other human brain. What this means for you practically, the warm cup is not a magic trick that will make a hostile person seem friendly. The thermal shift is modest. It operates at the margins of social evaluation, nudging the judgment, not overriding it. A warm cup will not make you trust someone who is actively deceiving you. It will shift the baseline from which you evaluate ambiguous social signals. The physician whose manner could be read as either professional efficiency or coldness, the neighbor whose comment could be interpreted as either honest or rude. In the ambiguous middle ground where most social judgments actually live, the thermal state of your hands is a variable. Not the only variable, but a variable that has been operating in every social evaluation you have ever made, without your knowledge, without your consent, and without any mechanism by which your conscious mind could have detected it. Now. What this means for the room you are sitting in right now. Because the temperature of the room in which a difficult conversation occurs is not a hospitality variable. It is a neurological one, and it operates through two routes simultaneously. First route is the insular overlap, thermal input shifting social evaluation through shared neural substrate. Second route is autonomic. Warm environment reduces peripheral sympathetic vasoconstriction, decreases sympathetic tone, increases parasympathetic tone. Your autonomic balance shifts toward the state associated with safety and social openness. Cold environment does the reverse. Sympathetic activation increases. The autonomic baseline shifts toward vigilance and defensiveness. Both routes bias your social evaluation in the direction the temperature predicts. Both operate below your awareness. Room temperature shifts negotiation behavior. Warm environments produce more cooperative negotiation strategies. Cold environments produce more competitive ones. Mechanism runs through the insular cortex pathway. Warm environment reduces sympathetic activation, signaling physical safety, and the autonomic state colors the social cognition operating concurrently. A person having a difficult conversation in a cold room is in a mildly elevated sympathetic state. Their insular cortex is processing the thermal input alongside the social evaluation of the person they are speaking to. The two signals interact at the level of shared neural substrate. Consider what that means practically. A physician delivering a diagnosis in a cold examination room is delivering it to a brain whose social evaluation circuits have been thermally biased toward suspicion. The patient may find the physician less trustworthy, less caring, not because of anything the physician said or did, but because the room was cold. A warm room, a warm beverage held during conversation, a comfortable thermal state. These are not comfort gestures. They are primers for the insular cortex, shifting the baseline of social evaluation circuits toward the trust end of the thermal social continuum. Consider the conversations in your own life that went badly in cold rooms. The family discussion in a drafty kitchen. The difficult appointment in an air-conditioned office. The first meeting with someone who felt cold and distant, in a room that was literally cold. You attributed the outcome to the relationship, to the person, to the content of what was said. Your insular cortex was processing the ambient temperature alongside every social evaluation you made during the conversation, blending the two inputs through shared neural circuitry, and delivering a judgment that felt like it was entirely about the person. The room was invisible. The room was always a variable. And now you know it was. Every warm room biasing you toward trust. Every cold room biasing you toward suspicion. Through neural architecture that operates below your ability to detect it. The knowledge does not eliminate the bias. The insular overlap is hardware, not software. And knowing about it does not give your consciousness access to the integration process. But the knowledge does give you something else, the ability to choose the temperature of the room before the conversation begins, the ability to hold a warm cup during the discussion, the ability to recognize when a social judgment feels cold, that the coldness may not be entirely about the person. It may be partly about the thermal state of the environment your insular cortex was processing alongside them. Cup before a difficult conversation, with a physician, a financial advisor, a family member discussing something fraught, is not a comfort object. It is an autonomic insular intervention that shifts the baseline toward trust, toward openness, toward the parasympathetic state in which difficult information is received with less defensiveness. Cup acts through both pathways simultaneously, insular overlap shifting your social evaluation directly, and autonomic shift moving your baseline toward parasympathetic safety. Your body holding that cup is neurologically and autonomically different from your body holding a cold glass, not dramatically different, measurably different. And the difference operates below your conscious awareness. Every social evaluation you have ever made was made by a brain simultaneously processing the physical environment through shared neural circuitry without disclosing the influence to you. The temperature of every room, the warmth of every object, the thermal state of your skin during every conversation. All of it fed into the social judgments you made, blended with the social data, and delivered to your consciousness as though the judgment were purely about the person. Every language uses thermal metaphors for social relations. Universality is not cultural. It is anatomical. The insular cortex overlap is present in every human brain, wired during the critical period when warmth and safety were one signal from one source. You have been using thermal language for social relations your entire life. Warm person, cold shoulder, heated argument, and you assumed it was figurative. It is not figurative. It is accurative. It is accurate. It is accurate. When you call someone warm, you are describing what your insular cortex does when it encounters that person. You were reporting neural architecture without knowing the architecture existed. The metaphor came from the hardware. Evidence converges from 6 directions. The cup study, however debated in magnitude, demonstrated the effect. The insular cortex anatomy explained the mechanism. Harlow's monkeys established the evolutionary origin. Zhong and Leonardelli's reverse pathway confirmed the bidirectionality. Barg and Shalev's loneliness data showed the chronic behavioral expression, and Lakoff's linguistic analysis showed that human language has been describing the insular overlap accurately for as long as language has existed. 6 independent lines of evidence pointing at a single anatomical fact. Your insular cortex does not separate temperature from trust because it was never designed to. That convergence. 6 independent lines of evidence arriving at a single anatomical fact through completely different methods is what settled it for me. Because any one finding can be questioned. 6 findings from 6 disciplines converging on one structure in one brain cannot be dismissed as an artifact of method. Your insular cortex cannot fully separate the temperature of a cup from the character of a stranger. The neural hardware that processes both was assembled across millions of years of primate evolution in a world where warmth and trust came from a single source: a mother's body, a social group's huddle, a shared fire that meant the presence of others. You have been making social judgments your entire life in rooms whose temperature you never considered as a variable, and every one of those evaluations was produced by an insular cortex simultaneously processing the thermal environment through shared circuits, blending the thermal input into the social output, delivering the result to your consciousness as a judgment you believed was entirely about the person. The cup was always a variable. The room was always a variable. You were never told. Question. Embodied cognition leaves open is the one that matters most. If your body's physical state changes your social judgment without your knowledge. If the temperature of a cup, the warmth of a room, the thermal state of your skin can shift how you assess another person's character through neural pathways you cannot monitor and did not know existed, then how much of what you have ever thought about another person was actually about them? How much was about the temperature of the room?